Pastor Deborah Prihoda is an incredible blessing and a resource to our district. Just a quality pastor and leader. She's the presbyter of the Houston section in our district, and she has a very deep burden for abuse that on occasion happens in the parsonage. There's not a lot of resource out there. It's kind of a hidden thing. It's not talked about a lot. Sometimes when a situation gets too far down the road, then we end up hearing about it. Almost there's nothing else to do at that point. So she and I collaborated. She resourced us with some ideas. I told her just to go with it and share, and that the district would come alongside this situation. Thus the little cards that are out there, the little square cards, these are meant for the ministers and their family to be able to, if a family member is going through something and they need someone to talk about, then the female in the house that possibly is going through abuse, a child or a spouse, the females can contact Deborah Prihoda, and then she can begin to walk alongside them. If it happens to be a male that is in the house, a child, or the husband, they can contact me, and I will walk through some things. We'll come alongside them, help them to get to a safe place to stay, and then assist them with travel to get to wherever they need to go to in the United States to be with family so that they can have a protection system. That's usually something very, very difficult when abuse happens, is being able to assist the person to get where they need to go and to get the help they need. So let's give Pastor Deborah Prihoda a hand. Thank you so much. Would you like to hold it? Okay. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. Everybody stay awake after that lunch break. I'm going to just dive right in as we go into abuse in the parsonage. I'm going to tie a little bit, of course, it goes with abuse overall. There are some specific challenges for victims in the parsonage, and we'll go through that as well. I didn't know if you realize this, but less than 1% of domestic abuse cases are actually reported to the authorities. That's in just the secular arena. And so I would venture to say that much less than 1% are reported in the ministry. In fact, battering is the single largest cause of injury to women, more than auto accidents, muggings, and rapes combined. However, not all abuse, I want us to realize this afternoon, leaves physical scars. The most dangerous time for a victim of abuse is when they decide to leave the home. And so that's very important for us to remember as pastors or people that would be counseling someone in that situation. Statistically, and this is the frustrating part as well, victims will return to a destructive relationship 7 times before they leave for good. A woman is 70 times more likely to be murdered in the few weeks after leaving her abusive partner than at any other time in the relationship. And when children are involved in the relationship, 90% of these children have been eyewitnesses to the violence. Not all abuse cases are the same. That's something we have to remember as pastors or those who will be ministering to those coming out of abuse situations. Even though they may share some things in common, the truth is, although we would like to think that otherwise abuse cases are all the same, once we've seen one abuse case, we've seen one abuse case. And although we would like to think otherwise, abuse does happen in pastors' homes. In December 27th, 2 days after Christmas 2009, a good friend of mine in the area, she was a co-pastor with her husband, founded a church in my area. She and her daughter were both stabbed to death in front of her daughter's 4 children by her daughter's estranged husband. It brought a lot of pain and suffering, not only to the family. That spouse is now serving on death row in Huntsville, But as far as it was painful for the church to go through and the community as well. And across a wide number of denominations, I've done the research. There was absolutely nothing to help for people in the parsonage or people in ministry situations, pastors' wives. I know there are husbands who are also abused, but since the majority of pastorates are males, it ventures to say that many times, more often than not, it will be the female spouse in the home that is being abused, with the husband being the pastor. And so I began looking through the research, couldn't find any, making phone calls and getting a lot of crickets. I had an evangelist that we have come often into our church, invited a friend of theirs from the area to come in, and she was going to lead praise and worship that night at the church where I pastor. And when she sat down at the piano, the evangelist friend of ours leaned over to me and said, she's just coming out of an abuse situation. She had been in a pastor's spouse for 26 years. And through the course of getting to know her and listening to her that night, I just felt the Holy Spirit drop into my heart that He had a new journey for me to go down. And so since that time, more women have come to the forefront, and unfortunately, you don't think of it being an issue in pastors' homes. You would hope that it wasn't an issue that we had to deal with, but it does, and it's still happening today. It has happened in the past, and for the most part, we don't know how to address this, because this kind of issue and situation, it's a double abuse of power. It's not only abuse of power by the spouse over their wife or their husband and the children and the family, but it's also abuse of power, I believe, in the church as a church leader. What is domestic violence? Domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behavior used by one partner to control, and that's the key word here, the other in an intimate relationship, and it takes many forms. We see physical abuse, sexual assault, economic control, or psychological and emotional abuse. A number of studies have been done and demonstrated that psychological abuse independently causes long-term damage to a victim's mental health, but God. And we'll talk about that as well. Here are some indicators for possible, I say possible, abusive relationship. A threat to hurt you or other people around you. Criticize or blame you for everything that goes wrong. Control your access to friends or family. Control your access to the money. Control the decision-making in your relationship. Control your time and your actions. Put you down in front of others. Make you feel like you're crazy or that you don't know what you're talking about. Sometimes in extreme cases, to destroy your property or abuse pets or animals, threaten to hurt you or commit suicide if you leave, and to force or coerce you to have sex when you don't want to. If you answered yes to any of those, or you know of somebody, it's a possibility, underlying possibility, that they could be in an abusive relationship. It's important to know that you're not alone, that there are people just like you dealing with different forms of abuse. You did not cause the violence, you didn't bring it on yourself, and no one has the right to hurt you. Deuteronomy 31:8 says this: "The Lord Himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you or forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged." What does an abuser look like? Profiles have been done on abuse cases, and these are they're common, but not in all cases. But you may not realize this, but an abuser feels powerless. And you may think, well, Deborah, how in the world can that happen? But that is the profile. They feel powerless. They don't act insecure to cover up the truth. In fact, they're often bullies. The one thing they all have in common is their motive is to have power over the victim. And this is because they don't feel like they have personal power regardless of the success. These may be people that look very successful in the world's eyes or in the church eyes, but on the inside, they feel very powerless. To them, communication is a win-lose game. They have some personality issues. They're very insecure. They have unrealistic expectations in a relationship, distrustful, often jealous. Sometimes they don't even want to leave their spouse alone to talk with someone else. They're being totally overlooked or, overheard when they're talking. They're kind of lending the ear. They're not allowed to have a Facebook page or emails. They read through all their emails. They deny their actions. They're verbally abusive. They need to be right and in control all the time. The spouse will have to scrimp money together for personal needs. They control their comings and their goings. They have to report in. If they don't call at a certain time, they're in trouble. So we can watch for these situations and these signs. They're possessive. They may try to isolate their partner from family or friends. Hypersensitivity, they aggressively react to things. They have a history of aggression. They're cruel to animals or children. They blame their behavior on others. This is a great deflector. It's always the other person's fault, or I didn't do it. It wasn't my fault. And so we have to remember that abuse is a deliberate attempt to gain control. And as pastors, we need to be aware of this in counseling situations, when we try to do marital help and that type of thing. You don't overcome abusive behavior by focusing on self-esteem or anger management. It's a totally different animal. And sometimes, we kind of run through our checklist because we as pastors aren't clinical psychologists or trained counselors or biblical counselors in that sense. So we have our checklist that we go through, and many times we think, okay, they need marriage counseling, they need anger management. That does not work in domestic abuse situations. Abusers are not sick, they're very clever, as I found out, and they're driven by a desire to control and manipulate the situation. And this, on the other hand, means that the victims, the spouse, they're not crazy. And they're being told that over and over, and they doubt and start to not trust their own feelings, their own emotions, their own judgments. And we need to be aware of this. And the question comes up, I know, as in one of the talks this morning, they talked about why don't they leave? Why don't they just go to the police? Well, in a ministry situation, that's difficult because it not only involves the church, but also credentials and those kinds of fear that it puts in there. So why a minister's wife might find it hard to leave, fear of more violence, fear of her children, fear of her own future. Many times she's told, well, if you leave this situation, I'm the breadwinner of the family and you won't have anywhere to go. I'll get the children. And so there's that fear that causes them to stay. They don't want to disgrace their spouse. They want to kind of uphold their view in the church, but as we look at these kind of situations, they say the most fearful time for a minister's spouse is on Sunday afternoon because of things that have happened during the church service. Maybe the sermon didn't go as they had planned, or someone said something to them, or they had a fear of something, then they go home and take it out on their family, on their spouse. And so that fear is a big trigger that keeps them in that home and afraid to move or take action. Abusers work hard on trying to isolate those that they're abusing by threatening or coercing, discrediting them, shaming them. Sometimes in front of the congregation, they'll discredit their wife, and they won't believe you anyway. And so we look at these kinds of situations that the wife has to go through, and the I don't want to say funny thing, but the kind of ironic thing is the wife doesn't hate her husband. She just wants the abuse to stop. And I have a picture of the cycle of abuse on the overhead, and this is a cycle that happens. They call it the honeymoon phase, and it comes right after the heated time, but this is when the spouse is sorry, they give flowers, they're so nice, they do all the great things that they're supposed to do, and then the tension building phase starts again, and then there's an abusive situation that happens, and it cycles over and over. And what we can see this happening with our eyes is, as pastors and dealing in situations, the spouse is oblivious to that because they're so wanting just to have a normal home, a normal family, and the spouse makes promises, I'll never do that again, but we know that they can't change on their own. They can't make it better. They need help. And so with all this manipulative apology, she believes he's going to change. And anyone that's come out of an abusive situation, whether it's violence or psychological abuse, you start believing those lies. And you start doubting your own judgment and your own feelings and emotions, and you can find yourself getting sucked in to their control and their manipulation. Fear, I mentioned this before, of losing financial stability, the spouse's job, shelter. If they live in a home with the church, what's going to happen to us? Where are we going to go? We don't have any savings. And plus the threat of violence, or maybe they have been ostracized from their family for many years. Maybe they've never told their family. So there's all these things that are looming over them, it feels like, that are the same in the church members type of domestic violence, but there's some specific things that ministers' wives have to deal with coming out in this situation that we have to be ready to deal with. 4 common mistakes that abuse counseling makes. Assume the marriage has to be reserved at all costs. Now, I am for marriage. My husband and I just celebrated our 45th anniversary, and thank you. And marriage is wonderful. We know that it works. We know God has designed marriage and the family. But I also know that a woman who has been battered or neglected or verbally abused, she doesn't need marriage counseling with her husband. She needs to hear the protective arms of Jesus that are going to help her and walk her through this situation. Sometimes the pastors, they assume that all divorce is sin, but a violent and abusive man has broken the marriage covenant already. And we need to let that spouse know that just because of his sinful choices, he is the divorcer, and that marriage is not honoring to God. That's not how God has designed marriage to be. As ministers, I believe, and I believe the Bible shows that we're held to a higher standard. We're going to have to answer to the Lord for how we've not only led our flock, but I believe been good shepherds in our families, to our children and our spouses. And so how can we stand in a pulpit and preach God's love and God's redemption and God's care, God's shepherding, while at the same time at our homes we're battering or abusing the children the Lord has entrusted us with, or the spouse that the Lord has trusted us with? The scriptures know them as well as I do in Ephesians that are always brought to front. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, and Christ was willing to give himself up for the church. And we have to finish those statements. Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands, but it also tells the husbands to submit himself as well. And we need to know there is a healthy marriage, that yes, my husband is head of our home. I know that the buck stops with him when the decisions are made, but we both mutually submit to one another in our love and in our serving and in our parenting. But yes, he's the head of our home. And we need to know that there is a healthy way. The problem isn't God's pattern. We're not going to change according to the times like the world shifts. It seems like it used to be every generation values would change. Now it seems like every other week, things change. We're not going to change God's message. His message, there's nothing wrong with his plan for the marriage and for the home and for the husband and the wife. That is consistent. It's man's corruption that has made it wrong. 1 Timothy 3:2-3 says that an overseer is supposed to be gentle and peaceable. Those higher standards that we're held to. We misunderstand the term forgiveness. We have to rightly understand the biblical teaching on forgiveness and reconciliation. They're two separate things. The end goal isn't a man back in his home or a woman back in her home if she's the abuser. The end goal is holiness. The end goal is health and healing. And reconciliation is not the same thing as reunion. And forgiveness isn't a demand from the abuser to say, well, let's just get this over with. Let's get it back so we can get back home and start living the way that we're supposed to live. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not synonymous. And we need to wrestle with that. Reconciliation implies that contact is necessary, whereas forgiveness can be internal and contact between the victim and the abuser never has to happen. And this is important because of the life-saving distinction in an abused woman. Safety for the children and for the woman, these are our goals. Accountability for the abuser, and I'm going to talk about hope in just a few minutes, but that abuser needs to be held accountable for what they are doing. Restoration of individuals. That woman needs to be restored. The children need to be restored. The husband or the man needs to be restored, but not necessarily reconciled. Is that making sense? And there needs to be a forgiveness. And sometimes restoration is possible, but sometimes it is not possible. And when that comes, there needs to be someone that walks alongside both parties, that mourning period, mourning that loss of that relationship and that family. What are some do's and don'ts of dealing? Suppose you come across a domestic violence victim or a domestic abuse victim. What are some do's and don'ts? Remember, all scars do not have to be visible to be domestic violence. Do believe her. Oftentimes, the descriptions that she's giving to you are only the tip of the iceberg. And so we need to realize that many times, especially when they first come forward, they're testing you. They're wanting to see, what are they going to do? What are they going to say? So belief is a huge factor in that beginning of that healing. Do reassure her that this is not her fault. Many times women are re-victimized when they're not believed or they're felt like they're just brushed off. She doesn't deserve this treatment. It's not God's will for her to be in an abusive situation. Do give referral resources and information. There's some great resources, phone numbers. Have those at your disposal so that you can use those. I know on the back of our credential card, there's Emerge Ministries. That's a great tool, but not all. If the spouse is not credentialed, she or he, they're not going to have access to that number. So have some other numbers available for them. Do respect and her choices. Do support her choices. That, remember, they're not my choices to make, they're her choices to make. They're his choices to make. Even if she is aware of the risks that are involved in staying, if she returns to her abuser, it's her choice, and she has to have the survival information that she needs. And so that's why the next step is help her with a plan. Talk through a plan to encourage her, a safety plan. She may need to set aside some money. Maybe she already has. Maybe that's something she needs to think about. Copies of important papers for her and her children. A change of clothes hidden somewhere, or in safekeeping of a friend if she is going to leave eventually. Have her plan in her mind how she's going to exit the house. And it's a good thing you don't write these things down. Don't give her written information, because if she sticks it in her purse or inadvertently forgets, that could be big trouble for her if her spouse goes through her purse later on and finds that information. And so you don't want to cause her any potential harm or damage. Plan to do, if they have children, what to do about the children. If the children are at school and she leaves, or if they're asleep, have her think through what her plan is going to be. This also helps her come with the terms that this is an abusive situation. This is not something that I'm making up, or I'm not crazy, but she needs to develop a plan. And then this safety plan is ongoing. Things change, situations change, and so make sure that she has a safety plan. This is big. Protect her confidentiality. Protect her confidentiality. Don't give information about her or her whereabouts to the abuser. Don't share any of this information with anyone else in your church, including your deacons, your wife, your spouse. Keep this information confidential, because you do not know who will accidentally tell somebody. Remember, the abuser is very manipulative. They act very innocent. I've heard reports of victims who have been in hiding or somewhere where they needed to be safe, and their estranged husband was told where they were. This is not acceptable. We have to keep that information confidential. Do pray with her. Do support her. Help her to mourn that loss. Be willing to do that. Do help her to see that her partner's violence has broken God's standards for marriage, and God doesn't, this isn't her cross to bear. He doesn't require that she remain in this situation where her life and the lives of her children are in danger if she decides to separate and divorce. Do assure her of God's presence and His love for her and your commitment to walk with her through the process. However, do not get emotionally involved with her. Watch your boundaries. That's what's so wise with Pastor Don, saying, women, contact me, the men contact Pastor Don, because these kinds of situations are very, very volatile, and they're very tricky to make sure that they're handled. And I'm not perfect. I'm not saying any of us are perfect, but please pray, because these situations can be very dangerous, as when we look into the situation of my friends that were in ministry that were murdered. You would have thought her mother's home was the safest place for her to be, but it wasn't. And so we have to be very careful. Pray with her. Ask God to give her the strength, the wisdom, the courage that she needs. Don't minimize the danger to her. Give her a reality check. Say, from what you've told me, I think you need to really consider what your resources are. I'm concerned for your safety. You can say those kinds of things. Don't tell her what to do. She has to make that decision. Just you give information and support. Don't react with disgust or, unbelief. I call it the poker face of ministry. I was in a board meeting couple of weeks ago and had some people from the community come and talk to the deacons, and they mentioned interfaith. And after they left, one of the deacons said, "Pastor, when they said interfaith, I looked at your face because I knew you wouldn't like to hear that." And I said, "Well, how did I react?" They said, "Your face just looked fine." I said, "Well, you know me, so you know that I'd have something to say about that to y'all after they left." But you know, keep that face on. Don't overreact. Don't you know, kind of blow it off, but listen to her. Be concerned for her. Don't minimize it, but also let her know that this isn't deserved by her. Don't let him blame her for his violence. This happens very often. If she's blaming, try to reframe what she said. You can tell her, I don't care if the supper was late, or I don't care if you did forget to water the lawn like you were supposed to. That is no reason for him to verbally or physically abuse you. So help her reframe and rethink. Don't recommend counseling for couples or marriage counseling, or, like I said, anger management, and do not go to the spouse to hear his or her side of the story. That can put them in grave danger. Even giving pamphlets to them to put in their purse or to hold. Watch emails. If you are sending emails back and forth or texts back and forth, more often than not, they're being read. And so be careful what you put electronically to the spouses. Don't send them home with just a prayer and a directive to submit to her husband. This has been done before. It may seem like, wow, who would, but you know, we do things without even thinking what we're saying sometimes because we get uncomfortable in dealing with these situations. They're not normal. And so we want to help, but sometimes saying the wrong thing is 10 times worse than not saying anything at all. But pray with them. Don't encourage her to forgive him and take him back. Don't encourage her dependence on you, or, like I said, to become emotionally involved with her. And don't do nothing. Don't do nothing. You can consult with people that are outside your network of influence. Call Emerge Ministries, and call Dr. Thomas, some of the others that are here today, that we're here to help. We're here to give information and resources where we can give. So be careful how we handle the information that we're given. And then also, I want to give some hope to the abuser. I found a great little article. It says, "Why do I resist help?" This is for the abuser. It says, "Seeking help doesn't come naturally for most of us as members of the clergy. From independence of the American spirit to the resistance of the male ego, there are lots of reasons why we resist getting help. The vast majority of clergy are male, and generally speaking, men enjoy the fixing role instead of getting help role. As men want to tinker with it, think it's better. We think it's better when it's not. We want to shift the blame. We do this because we deceive ourselves into thinking we're protecting ourselves and others, but we're actually destroying ourselves and others. We could characterize some of this as human pride, but it also says, I know better. I'm okay. What will they think of me if they know what's wrong with me? I'm not as bad as you think. No one will ever convince me that I'm wrong. And additionally, clergy persons, we're in the helping business. It's kind of like a shift in our thinking when we have to think of ourselves in the needing to get help business. But that's basically bottom line is what we have to do. And some help by the reasoning, how could I be so helpful to others if I'm so broken? And it's not supposed to happen to clergy. We aren't supposed to need the help, but some clergy find that they're embarrassed to have to ask for the help. They risk asking for help because they're afraid. The unknown is huge for them. They're afraid they're going to lose their status in the congregation, afraid they're going to lose their family, afraid they're going to lose their livelihood. And so they think seeking help is threatening, and that very fear of seeking help is what's going to destroy them. So we need to give them that knowledge that hope in the Lord is there for them. Yes, there may be some things that they need to do to change, but how much greater will the outcome be if they're whole and healthy in the long run? And so whatever their resistance is to help, it's ultimately that resistance is what is going to destroy them. And so that hope, might not mean reconciliation with their spouse, but it will mean reconciliation with them and the Lord. And that's what's the most important thing. It says here, you could lose everything because you refuse help which is available and ready to let you know that there is hope for healing, and it's up to you. It's a sad day to think that we have to address this kind of issue, and it's sad to think that there hasn't been much help in this area in the past, but I'm so thankful for our district, for Pastor Don in leading this, and Pastor Tim for allowing this message to be made open to everybody, and to let the people in the parsonage and the ministry, the people that give their lives, are missionaries. We've had missionaries that have had to live in this kind of situation, and they feel trapped. They feel like there's no way to get hope or get out of the situation or to get help in the situation. But I'm seeing the days are changing. And we're so excited that mental health, they say that the ministry is up there with law enforcement, with PTSD and psychological burnout and those kinds of things, because there are so many stressors, and it's not going to get any better, is what my Bible tells me. In the last days, it's going to get worse and worse, and we have to look at God's Word. We have to look at the resources that we have and come together in unity so that we make it to the end. That's what we want to hear ultimately. Well done, my good and faithful servants. And there is hope and healing for the abuser, and there is hope and healing for the victims and their families. Thank you so much for allowing me to come today.
Thank you so much, Pastor Prihoda. Some of you may not be aware that Pastor Prihoda and her team represented our district in creating national general council policy at this last general council in Orlando. They went and met with the executive team in Springfield, made their case, dealing with abuse, to support the abused, and policy was established and passed at General Council. And so we thank you, Pastor Deborah, for representing not only us, but the entire General Council and ministry families. Let's give her another hand.